Welcome to BornCurious, coming to you from Harvard Radcliffe Institute. I'm Ivelisse Estrada, your co-host.
And I'm your co-host, Heather Min. Today we will explore ideas about culture and sexuality. Our guest is Jennifer S. Hirsch, co-author of the groundbreaking 2020 book, Sexual Citizens, Sex, Power, and Assault on Campus.
Sexual Citizens has been described as the book to read to help lead conversations about sex. It reveals the social and cultural ecosystem that makes sexual assault on campuses a predictable part of college life for far too many. But it also offers practical solutions for stemming this violence.
Jennifer Hirsch is a fellow here at Radcliffe, and we asked her to join us to talk about her work and to tell us a bit about her first case study, the book she is working on this year. And a note that this episode includes explicit language and mature themes, so listener discretion is advised.
Jennifer S. Hirsch is a professor of sociomedical sciences at the Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health and a 2024-2025 fellow at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. She works at the intersection of social science and public health. Thanks for being here, Jennifer.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be with y'all.
We are so excited to get this chance to learn about your work.
What drew you to focus on the anthropology of love and sexuality? How did this all start?
I mean, I always kind of like to talk about sex. I was a gender, at that point it was called women's studies, and history major in college. And then I sort of veered off. I wanted to do something social justice-y, so I went into public health. And at that time, there was no work on cultural dimensions of contraception. Demographers who were in this space at that time talked about sex as being at the risk of conception. Like, could you possibly develop a more boring way to talk about sex, right? And I was like, this is sometimes passionate, sometimes confusing, like embodied, messy experience that people are having. We can't understand why people do or don't use contraceptives without paying attention to what else they're doing when they're using them. And so that was sort of the moment when I was like, okay, this is my direction. I'm going to work on culture and sexuality in public health.
What was the first thing you investigated?
My dissertation research, which actually I've sort of come full circle back to now, was looking at changing ideas of love and marriage among Mexican migrants in Atlanta and their families who had remained in Mexico. I started out thinking I was going to do like a here versus there comparison between Atlanta and southwestern rural Mexico. And then in the way that always happens when you do anthropology, you go to the field and you see that you're asking the wrong question because people tell you you're asking the wrong question. So I was like, blah, 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 blah about differences between here and there. And women were like, no, we are not as easily bossed around as our mothers were. So like they were telling me, focus on generational change, not migration-related change. And so I ended up writing a book that was about changing ideas of love and marriage in this Mexican transnational community, which was really about like heterosexual marriage, which most of the work on sexuality had been on queer sexualities or sex work or adolescent sexuality, because I guess married sex is like too boring to even notice. So there was a pioneering contribution in terms of like the cultural anthropology of marital sex and love.
How do you approach the study of attraction, love, gender, sexuality, disease, and violence?
As an anthropologist, I approach it by opening the door for people to tell me their stories. I think about the story of Austin, who we interviewed in Sexual Citizens, who told us about assaulting somebody in the first week of school. And he didn't know that he had assaulted someone until he told us that story. We asked him, tell us about your worst sexual experience. And he told us a story in which he was sent off to sleep in a room where there was a girl sleeping. And she lifted up her head and she said, I don't want to do anything. And he didn't listen to that. He got in bed with her and he started to touch her body. And so then he went on in the interview, and it wasn't until later when we asked him, well, what's a sexual assault? And he said, well, it's any unwanted, non-consensual anything. But then he paused And his eyes kind of filled up with tears. And he said, and this is how he said it, he said, "Fuck me." Because like that was the moment when the penny dropped. And that's not the kind of understanding of people's up close experiences that you could ever get in a survey. You can only get that kind of window into someone's lived experience in conversation with them. That's the kind of work I do.
Can you tell me a little bit about the study that Sexual Citizens was based on?
Yeah. So in 2014, there was a lot of conversation about sexual assault on college campuses, but mostly it was focused on college campuses as like a hunting ground where we have to find bad people and track them down and do a better job of punishing them. And I knew as a public health person that that wasn't going to solve the problem. And I'd spent my whole career understanding how the things that people do with their bodies in relation to sex are socially organized, that people don't just choose to do one thing or another, that it's shaped by their context. And so I thought, actually, I could solve this problem, right? I'm going to take that same optic about intimacy as shaped by social context and apply it to the problem of campus sexual assault. So I always joke, like, this is not a problem we're going to solve one penis at a time. We need to look at the broader environment. And so I pitched to the then I think executive vice president for University Life. I pitched to her, I'm like, I want to do a little study about the social roots of campus sexual violence. And she was very encouraging. And so I brought in my friend who's a clinical psychologist and had experience doing trauma research. And we put together like a moonshot dream team of 8 faculty members. And we're like, okay, if we had enough money to do the best kind of research, what would we do? And so we developed this big project that had 3 different kinds of data collection. It had the ethnography and it had 2 kinds of survey research. And it used what's called a community-based participatory research mode. So as opposed to like doing research and then later telling the people who you want to help what you found, you're in conversation with them the whole time. And so we had a board of institutional advisors, like senior administrators, but we also had a group of undergraduates who met with us every Monday at 8 a.m. for the entire duration of the project and advised us on things like how to word questions in the questionnaire and how to recruit people. And they were a very diverse group, everything from like, a senior person in Greek life to like the feminist activists who were most critical of the university's response. So those students sort of propelled us forward and kept us from making all kinds of terrible mistakes. And part of what was extraordinary, I just want to name, is that unlike most universities, which have really tried to squash research on sexual assault on their campus, Columbia funded the whole project. It was a very generously funded project. So it was a sort of a singular experience. And, kudos to them for giving us not just the money, but administrative and legal support, and then staying out of our way, not trying to control us intellectually. So it was really it was a perfect experience from that regard. And that was the project that we drew on in writing Sexual Citizens.
And you had a team of ethnographers?
So we had a team for the ethnographic research. My colleague Seamus Khan and I hired younger people who could stay up later than 9 o'clock because most of student social life happens like far after my bedtime and after Seamus's bedtime. And so we had these 3 extraordinary young ethnographers. And it was very important to explain that they weren't spies, right? Like they always told people that they were doing research. And they did some of the interviewing and they did all the hanging out. And so they were deeply embedded in campus life and everything from like, Greek life to intramural sports to riding the bus up to the athletic center to like sitting around and playing board games. So they gave us a flavor and an understanding of how students go about their daily lives. Aside from the fact that the parties happen after my bedtime, like it would be super creepy to see your professor at a party. Nobody wanted to see us there. We did not want to be there. So it was a much better setup to hire young people than
Whose mom are you?
Yeah, exactly. Well, right. Well, I mean, you read the book, so you know that the one time I was on campus during orientation, and I was sort of lingering outside one of the freshman dorms, and one of the students turned to someone else, and it was after the parents were supposed to be gone. I was like, dude, someone's mom is here. So, I mean, yeah, I looked like someone's mom. I was someone's mom.
How do you define sexual citizenship then?
Sexual citizenship is the right to choose your own sexual experiences and the and is very important, to understand that other people have that same right. So basically, like, other people, not human scratching posts. And so in that story that I told about Austin, like, he was very focused on choosing his own sexual experience, but he forgot in that moment that that girl in that bed was a living, breathing human being who had told him very clearly that she was not interested in him touching her.
So, sexual assault is when you cross the line in seeing the other person as an equal participant. You also talk at length in your book about alcohol and the impairment there. What are other modes of inequality that somehow enables that kind of situation to play out?
So, in Sexual Citizens, we bring 3 ideas to understanding the social roots of campus sexual assault. I already explained sexual citizenship, but the second idea is sexual projects. Sexual projects ask the question, which you might think like only a professor would ask, of what sex is for. Because you might think like, oh, we know what sex is for. It's for fun. But like a lot of the sex that these kids were having was not so fun. And it's not for babies because none of them were trying to have babies. And so by asking what sex is for, you can get a sense of like what people are trying to accomplish through sex, which is important because if you're trying to change people's behavior, you need to start with like, where are they going, right? So there's sexual citizenship, there's sexual projects, and then the most innovative idea in the book, the one that people, when we say it, they're like, oh my God, I can't believe I never thought about that before, is how space shapes sexual interaction. So, like, instead of having space be like a backdrop where things happen, it's almost like a third actor that shapes what people do. So, like, think in the Austin story, he was sent into that girl's room. The reason he was sent there is because first year students almost always live in shared bedrooms where they're like 2 beds. And so if one person who lives in that room wants to have sex with someone, the other person who lives in that room gets sent to sleep somewhere else. They're sexiled, as the kids call it. And so Austin was sexiled to his roommate's girlfriend's room. So that's a choice that people make when they allocate housing, right? Like we make a decision that fourth year students should have the best rooms, right? Like private bedrooms and living rooms where they can have parties, and that first year students somehow should have the worst rooms, like because they need to earn better space. In the same way, like I've seen colleagues cry because their offices aren't as big as they think they deserve. Like everywhere, space is about power. And so by making space about power in that micro level way, we shape sexual interactions. And then there are lots of other components to sexual geographies. Like when you walk into, I don't know how frequently you've been in a dorm room, but there's 4 pieces of furniture. There's a desk chair, a dresser, and a bed.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. And so like 2 people go into a dorm room at the end of the evening, the bars have closed, the parties are over. Where are they going to sit? They're going to sit on the bed. Again, like that's a choice. You could furnish dorm space with cozy spaces with couches. In the Columbia dorms where Seamus and I were toured around by students, all of the lounges had armchairs, like armchairs that you couldn't fit 2 people in. So that's like a furnishing choice, which then has consequences because that pushes people more into those single bedrooms. Then there's another dimension of sexual geographies, which has to do with control of social space. One of the students that we spoke with described the Columbia campus as a white space. And we asked what she meant by that. And she said, well, it's full of guys who listen to shitty music, don't find me attractive, drink too much, and can't dance. And like she didn't actually find them attractive either. And so in Sexual Citizens, we tell the story of her meeting a guy who wasn't a student and going off campus, being assaulted by him. Like, we don't know that she wouldn't have been assaulted on campus, but what pushed her off campus was the domination of high value social spaces by upper class, wealthy white men who shaped the social scene in a way that she didn't feel included in. So that's, again, is a malleable characteristic, not by shutting down the non-university controlled spaces like final clubs or Greek life, but by universities deciding that if they're going to build demographically diverse student bodies, that they need to make sure that all the students have places where they can host parties, right? It's not enough to like give the queer kids a lounge where they can have meetings, because if you can't throw a party in that space, and there are lots of other spaces on campus that do throw parties, then the queer kids are never going to really feel like it's their place. So sexual geographies, we think, is actually like the big idea in the book because it points to things that universities can change. So in the intersection, sexual citizenship, sexual projects, and sexual geographies help us understand how different aspects of the campus environment and the lives that students lead before they come onto campus create a perfect storm where sexual violence is inevitable as a part of the campus experience.
We would love to hear more about what you mean by sexual projects. What is sex for? If we don't do it for fun, for pleasure, or for making babies, what else is there?
So in Austin's case, sex was for making up for his inexperience. He came onto campus, he'd gone to Catholic school, he didn't have a lot of experience with girls, and he was in a panic because he felt like everybody had more experience than he did. So he just wanted to get rid of the stain of inexperience. Sometimes sex is for showing off. I think about one young woman who had a really terrible experience, which I'm not going to describe because it's too complicated. But the next day at brunch, she passed her phone around with that guy's picture. She set aside the awfulness of the experience because it was a status achievement. So sex is for status. It's for the status of your group. People talk about people who are out of your league. Sometimes, a fraternity will match up with a sorority, and then you wouldn't want to go with like a girl in a lower status sorority, not just because she's beneath you, but because her whole group is beneath your group. So sex can be for status. Sometimes it's for expressing care and affection. That wasn't like the most common thing we heard, but we did hear it on occasion. And the men, in fact, we asked them like what their dreams were, and they're like, oh, I want to take a girl out in a swan boat in Central Park. Like they had very romantic, unrealized relationship goals. So it can be for a lot of things. And, if two people each want to have hookup sex with someone they barely know when they're a little tipsy, like people do all kinds of stupid things because they're fun, right? Our point, and in fact, have you ever been in a bar? You see a lot of people over the age of 21 drinking so that they can then hope to have sex. So like drunk sex is not an experience that is isolated to younger people. Yes, it is something that produces vulnerability for sexual assault, but rather than talking to people who are assaulted and saying, don't drink because you might get raped, I think we need to look in the other direction, the same way we do with drunk driving, and say, don't get so drunk because if you have really drunk sex, you might rape someone, right? In the same way, like with drunk driving, we don't say, don't drink because you might crash. We say, don't drink and drive because you might hurt someone. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the message we need to be giving about drunk sex, while also acknowledging that for some young people, the need to get drunk is a result of the shame that they've grown up with around sexuality. I think about one young woman who described getting drunk before hooking up as like Novocaine before the dentist. And like, oof, my heart broke in a million tiny pieces. But like, she didn't want to be hooking up really, because it's kind of awkward to be naked with someone you just met. But she felt like it was part of college. She wanted to be college. And so she sort of had to numb herself in order to do that. So that's a socially produced shame around sex. It's the pressure to like only socialize in a particular way. All of those are malleable things. Like we built this world. They're just suffering in it.
So what role do communities, not just universities, but larger communities play in showing you what a healthy sexual relationship looks like?
So part of that is definitely comprehensive sex ed, which, research shows overwhelmingly that parents want their children to get comprehensive sex ed because they don't want to be doing it. And that's true across the political spectrum.
And what do you mean by comprehensive sex ed if it's not just simply the mechanics of the birds and the bees.
So it starts with that basic idea about respect for other people's physical autonomy. And then as children get older, they get age-appropriate messages about what they need to do to take care of their own bodies, to take care of other people's bodies if they're going to be with them sexually, give them an opportunity to think about what kinds of relationship they aspire to think about how sex can be complicated across lines of gender difference or age difference or racial inequality. So to really think about how they want to move through the world as sexual people. And then to actually develop some of the skills they need, whether it's like figuring out actually how condom works or developing comfort in talking about sex so that they can go from having a sexual project to enacting it in a way that doesn't disrespect someone else's sexual citizenship. So the work that we present in Sexual Citizens was part of this much bigger project that I co-led with my friend and colleague, Claude Ann Mellons. And in addition to the ethnography, which I've mostly been talking about, we did a survey. And so one of the findings from the survey showed that women in the Columbia Barnard campus who had had comprehensive sex ed before they got to school, that included training them, like practicing how to say no to sex they didn't want to have, which is not abstinence-only sex education. It's just sex education that includes a skills development component, like any good education does. So those women were half as likely to be raped in college. I just want to say that again, half as likely. So like basically, we already have a sexual assault prevention vaccine, and we are in a policy context where policymakers are choosing not to make it available to our young people, and where parents are not doing the political work of organizing in order to press for that, because there's one very loud, very small group of parents that's chasing around the policymakers who support comprehensive sex ed. And we know that comprehensive sex education that starts in kindergarten protects young people from child sexual abuse. Like there's a lot of evidence that it's protective. And so rather than characterizing the politicians who support that legislation as abusers, actually like the people who oppose the legislation, that's the pro-sexual violence camp.
It was shocking to read that these high-achieving, very intelligent students at an Ivy League university, a lot of them don't know their own physical sexual biology. You also remark how exceptional those young people who are fortunate enough to have open communication with their parents.
Indeed. I mean, there was one young man who was not American, and he had a girlfriend, and he was shocked. He described to us, he said, she doesn't even know where her holes are. So like, and these are smart kids, right? They obviously, they did well on the SATs, they have all the grades, but that basic information, I think we can be shocked at the individual stories, or we can look upstream and say, who is producing this? And like again and again, it is state level policymakers.
I feel like we need to put this kind of in a larger context, right? Like the sexual violence piece of it.
Sure.
Because it is a problem. And I think we're shocked by how big of a problem it is. So I wonder if you can talk about that.
Every institution in which there are people has a sexual violence problem, right? So media, athletics, religious institutions, the military, people everywhere hurt people through sex. And like one take could be that humans are deeply flawed. And I mean, yes, humans are deeply flawed, but like it's also because they're not taught to do better. Since people have started to measure sexual assault on college campuses since about the 80s, since Mary Koss's pioneering work, we've known that somewhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 women experience sexual assault on college campuses. And it's not always rape. It can be any kind of unwanted, non-consensual sexual anything. And now that we've started measuring sexual assault among men and among queer students, we know that a non-trivial proportion of men have non-consensual sexual experiences, and about half of LGBTQ students have non-consensual sexual experiences. And then there are other forms of harm that might not always be categorized as sexual violence in a survey, or that people might experience in other ways, but that really need to be counted. When we spoke with women in the interviews, the Black women who we interviewed, every single one of them had experienced non-consensual sexual touching on campus. Every single one. And our argument there is not that Columbia and Barnard are more racist as environments than other places, but that those experiences of non-consensual touching, that's a manifestation of anti-Black racism, right? And so we have learned to see sexual violence in intersection with other manifestations of social inequality. So why have we been measuring the problem for so long and not doing anything about it? I think in part, you can't solve a social problem that no one cares about, right? And so for decades, a very tenacious and dedicated group of researchers, most of whom were psychologists, were working to just get the problem on the map as a public problem. So they produced a ton of evidence that it's a problem in the face of really strong headwinds, because no university wants to be known as the rapiest university, right? And so it's hard to get tenure if the thing that you're working on is measuring levels of sexual violence at your own institution. That is typically not very welcome information. On top of that, there's very little funding for this kinds of research. So there was, for like a heartbeat under President Carter, there was a center at NIH that I think was called something like the National Center for the Prevention and Control of Rape. Wow, right? And then under President Reagan, it was folded into something else and ceased to exist. So there's very little dedicated research funding to solve the sexual violence problem. And a lot of the funding that there is from the federal government goes to care for survivors, which is obviously very important. But you're never going to fix a problem by taking care of the people who experience that problem, right? You need to look at the people who caused that problem, to look upstream. And then part of the problem has been owned by psychologists who don't typically have the tools really to look upstream towards the broader context, because that's not what they do as psychologists. And then the other part of the problem has been owned by lawyers. Again, their work is very important. I am not a lawyer. I want to stay in my lane. But so the optic that they bring to the conversation about campus sexual assault is about questions about evidence and fairness of adjudication. And the campus adjudication processes are experienced by students on all sides as extremely harmful. So my point is, there is certainly room for improvement in those processes. But again, like, such a small proportion of assaults are reported. In the survey we did, about 5% of assaults led to a formal report. And there can't be an adjudication process unless there's a formal report. So basically, like, what we knew about sexual violence came from that 5%, that small percent that were reported, and then the surveys about the characteristics of people who are assaulted. So neither of those kinds of information lead us towards radical change. They just help us understand little pieces of the problem. Imagine an iceberg, right? So like, what we knew was the little piece of the iceberg that was above the water. And so in the book, we take readers beneath the water. We're like, okay, let's map the whole iceberg, and then let's stop crashing into it.
So how do we address it? What would be the ideal way? What does the ideal approach look like?
The ideal approach looks like thinking in a very ambitious way about who's responsible for this problem. So rather than chaining ourselves to university presidents' doors and saying you're doing a terrible job with this problem, let's start with kindergarten. In fact, let's start before kindergarten. Let's start like when you're doing those early diaper changes. And the parents say like, oh, look at your pee-pee or your hoo-ha, right? Like, what they're communicating is that your penis or your vulva is like so unspeakably shameful that you can't even say the word, right? So like, let's talk about that. Let's fast forward to the schools that young people grow up in. If a young person grows up in a school that is not inclusive of sexual and gender minorities, that doesn't have a gay-straight alliance, that teaches sex education that is shaming, that doesn't provide all the information, or that suggests, like, in fact, that gay people don't even exist because it only talks about heterosexual sex, if that young person goes to a church that is not a queer inclusive church, like, basically think about every institution that young people pass through before they move their bags onto campus freshman week. And, like, say to them, okay, what are you doing to solve this problem? For example, religious institutions, like the conversation about religious institutions and sexual violence has mostly been focused on making sure they are spaces free from sexual harm. And, like, yes, agree, very important. But that's a pretty low bar for an institution, the goal of which is to teach people how to live a good life. I taught sex ed in my temple. Like, I want every religious institution to help young people make the connections between what we say about being a good person and what we think about being a good person in relation to sex. I think it's a lot to ask for young people to make those connections on their own.
I went to college in the late 80s. And Revenge of the Nerds,
Oof.
Animal House, Love Story. And I was really surprised to read that, 30 years later, they still have this imprint of doing college. Talk about that.
So I think that, yes, also early 80s, a very rapey time. So I think what's changed is that higher education, residential elite higher education, is an institution that was designed for wealthy white heterosexual men. And now our student populations are much more diverse. And just as a side note, I want to remind listeners that, like, most people in America who are going to college are going to community college and living at home, right? So the thing that we think of when we think about doing college is basically a pretty elite experience, whether you're at an Ivy League school or a state school. So the template of what college is an institution that was designed for people like my father, right, who used to send his ironing home on a train. Nobody sends their ironing home on a train, but there still are kids who pay for laundry service, right? So, but, like, those kids are no longer the majority. But that idea of doing college reflects the tastes and preferences of wealthy white heterosexual men. And, like, I just want to be clear, wealthy white heterosexual men, not bad people, right? Describes my husband, my sons. It doesn't make you a bad person to have all that social power. It just means that you have an outsized imprint on your social environment. And so that idea of doing college, it's not everyone's idea of doing college. There are lots of students who experience elite higher education as not a place that they want to be socially. But the people whose culture is still seen as, like, the culture of elite higher ed are people who have a lot of money and like to drink and drink a lot. So that's not everyone's preference, but that is still sort of like the image. I think we can change that.
So Animal House is still, looming large on the current college experience. How do you combat that?
We can do big things in public health. I feel like saying that now, 2024, has sort of like a different resonance than saying it in 2020 before COVID. Like, it was before everybody hated public health. But we can do big things in public health. We brought down the rates of smoking, right? We didn't bring down the rates of smoking by telling people they were bad people if they smoked. And there was a little bit of that, the sort of truth campaign, the advertisements for young people, you're dupes of big tobacco. But basically, we changed the smoking environment. We made it illegal to smoke in a lot of places. We made cigarettes very expensive. So there were structural changes that made it a harder choice to make. It's very hard to change the imprint, to change what's inside people's heads. And it's largely, I think, kind of sketchy for policymakers to even try. Do we really want them to be trying to change what's in our heads? I don't think so. But to make an environment where people are less likely to suffer harm, I hope we can all get on board and be like, okay, that is the job of whether it's, policymakers or academic leaders to build a safer environment. So I think rather than focusing on driving culture change, let's transform sexual geographies. Let's make clear to young people what the tools are to respect other people's sexual citizenship. Let's provide educational experiences where young people can develop clarity about their own sexual projects, and if they're in a faith community, about what the sexual projects of that faith community are and how they relate to those. So I think there are concrete changes that we can make in the world rather than trying to like re-educate people.
One thing that is novel to people going to college now, as opposed to 30 years ago, dating app. Could you talk about that phenomenon?
Yeah, so the sort of online dimension of sexual and social life wasn't a major area of emphasis in our research, but it was also unavoidable because it is how a lot of young people connect socially. We think that there's really like a sort of adult moral panic around online conversation, sex, etc. I'm not going to say the conversation about like going on the apps is unimportant. Right? I mean, there certainly is like digital sexual harassment. That's a different conversation. But so if you have two people in a room together, they need to understand that like saying something on an app is not the same as wanting to do something in person. But that's not a different conversation than understanding that like when you're doing something with someone, you can change your mind. So I think it's still like we need to do better at helping people understand to listen to each other when they're having sex. That sex is not something you do to a person, it's something you do with a person.
Something that's bubbled up recently, this notion, your body, my choice, and where that type of thinking might come from. You have talked about different ways that we can combat that, but there are communities around the world who, consider women second-class citizens. And short of dismantling the patriarchy,
I mean, let's smash the patriarchy, right? I'm here for that.
what can we do?
I mean, we actually, I'm not going to say we saw the Your Body, My Choice coming, but there's a story in Sexual Citizens of a man who's on a very low status athletic team. And he is extremely verbally abusive to his girlfriend, who's a student at Barnard. I think like feminazi, like all of those words were mobilized. And we read that as his response to being in an environment where he felt like he was at a disadvantage as a man. Like he saw other men in the better fraternities, the wealthier guys, and it was he wanted to lift himself up by pushing her down. So that is like a minute example from 2015 of what you see now en masse, except it's been given a permission structure to be amplified.
Mhm.
Sexual Citizens came out in 2020. It was voted an NPR Book of the Year. What has been the reception of the books now that it's been out for 4 years?
It's been incredible, like something I never would have imagined. We weren't on the New York Times bestseller list. We were never reviewed in like the places we hoped to be. We didn't get any big prizes, but in terms of the impact that the book has had, it's just been extraordinary. Like the book has changed how everyone who works in this space thinks about the problem because it's given people a new language that is much more prevention oriented and it brings in forms of sexual harm that are not illegal. Like people have a real hunger to talk about the ways that people can hurt each other or be bad actors or be cruel or unkind. The conversation shifts from like, let's not do something that's illegal to how do you have sex in a way that reflects the kind of person you want to be? Everywhere I go, there are young people who want me to sign the book. So that's like, I mean, honestly, I don't want to die soon, but like if I died, I feel like this book, like it's my legacy. I've like created something enduring that has changed how people think about a
The book
problem.
is so clear in terms of the prevention suggestions that it makes, but also so compelling in the stories that you share, that these students have shared with you.
I mean, every single interview I did, I wanted to consensually give them a hug afterwards because the experiences that they described, and not just the experiences of assault or of assaulting someone, but the suffering, financial stress, losing a parent, mental health struggles, roommates' mental health struggles. It is really, really hard to be a college student. And so we tried to bring their struggles and their suffering alive to do justice to the very, very intimate stories that they shared with us.
And we understand that Harvard Athletics made quite the order of the book, and they gave it out to 800 student athletes. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so we pivoted to being virtual pretty quickly. The book came out in January of 2020. By March, our whole book tour was virtual. We were, Zoom early adopters. And I don't remember exactly when the Harvard event was, but they bought a copy for every single student athlete. We actually had a super fan who was the women's hockey assistant coach, and she somehow reached out to us and she was like, "Oh my God, will you come to Harvard virtually and do a thing?" We're like, "Yes, we'll do a thing for anyone anywhere." And so that was fun. And we do all of our events not as a, blah, 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 but as a conversation. And I think for student athletes, especially, they so often feel vilified, like as if somehow they are the heart of the problem on every campus. And, we don't do that in the book.
Are there any schools who have implemented your suggestions?
Part of our prevention vision is to go beyond schools. And so we love how people have used the book to argue for legislative change or to argue for comprehensive sex ed in their own kids' school. And our recommendations for schools are really to focus on sexual geographies. So we developed, and this is not something that we're selling, it's a free resource that people can download from our website, Sexual Citizens. It's called the Sexual Assault Prevention and Campus Equity, or SPACE Toolkit. And what the toolkit does is it takes the idea of sexual geographies and it lays out a process through which schools that want to transform those sexual geographies can do so. So they commit to the process, they convene a multi-sectoral committee. And this is important because the Title IX people, the sexual assault prevention people, they don't have any authority over rooming policy or the allocation of social space. And so if you want to go big and solve this much more complicated problem about inequalities in how students live and socialize, you need to bring in other people. So commit to doing it, convene a committee, consider the sexual and social geographies on your campus, and then find a thing to change. So one of the schools that used the SPACE toolkit, they, came together, had some meetings, drew some pictures, made some maps, and then they said, you know what, let's bring back the fire pits. So during COVID, they had created, this is a school in Wisconsin, they had created fire pits where students who didn't have a place that they owned to socialize could hang out and roast marshmallows and be outdoors together in the evening and talk and, whatever. And that was their solution. So is that going to solve every incident of sexual assault? No, but that insight that we can change the way students socialize by changing the spaces to which they have access is fundamental to our vision. I mean, we actually, early on in the research process, we had a committee of senior administrators at Columbia who are our institutional advisory board. And on that committee was the vice president of facilities. And I think the whole time he was like, what am I doing here? He had been voluntold to be on the committee. The president asked you to do something, you do it. But he was like, I'm not a sexual assault prevention anything. I'm in charge of the menus and the housing. And then when we were sharing with him this idea of sexual geographies and how students are shuffled back into bedrooms when the parties end and the bars close, it was you could see a light bulb go off. And he was like, you know what? I can solve that problem. And so he decided to keep one of the cafeterias open till 6 a.m. so that students could hang out and shoot pool and have French fries. And again, are greasy French fries going to solve the whole problem? No, but they're going to just create another place for students to go if they want to continue a conversation and they don't want to sit on a bed with someone.
Mm.
So simple. So genius. Oh my gosh. And how does that bring you full circle now?
So a couple of years ago, Frady Reese, who is herself a survivor of forced marriage, cold called me. And she said, I'm looking for someone to do some research on sexual violence. And I was like, oh, well, that is what I do. And so she wanted a partner to do research on forced marriage, sex, and reproduction among Orthodox Jews in New York. And she's trying to get people to care about this as a problem in the same way that like nothing was happening with sexual violence because people didn't think of it as a problem. And she actually had been told by some forced marriage working group that she didn't belong in the group because there's no such thing as forced marriage in the United States. So she's like, we need more research to show that there is. And one thing led to another. And so the project that I'm doing, and the book that I'm writing here at Radcliffe looks at coercion and self-determination in marriage, sex, and reproduction among Orthodox Jews. And I think it's very important to articulate it's not an expose, it's a case study. And the idea is that there is an ecology of self-determination. Then, like, yes, things happen between two people, but they happen in a broader context. And so the book it's not about what's wrong with the Jews. It's about the whole context in which people experience things that are very harmful and coercive and what we can do to prevent that.
Did you have any pushback while you were doing the research, though? How did you...
I mean, I bring myself into the work as we always do as anthropologists, and the pushback, I'm like, what kind of pushback do you want me to talk about? Because there were so many different kinds of pushback, but it was very important. We knew from the beginning that we wanted to interview people who had remained observant, in addition to people who had left, and people who were married, in addition to people who had left their marriages, because you can't understand how a road system works by only looking at the car crashes, right? Like you need to map the whole system. And to understand why things go wrong, you also need to look at cases in which they don't go wrong. And so this was never like a hit job about why arranged marriage is bad. It was always trying to look at the whole picture. And so like a big pushback for all kinds of reasons, Orthodox, and when I say Orthodox, I mean what people sometimes describe as ultra-Orthodox, not modern Orthodox, which people who are modern Orthodox are very much more engaged in the modern world and modern institutions. I mean ultra-Orthodox, so like yeshivish or Hasidic Jews, the people you think of in like the hats or like the long skirts and the wigs, very suspicious of outsiders. And so it was hard to do the recruiting. And when I would sometimes get somebody to answer my email and they'd be like, maybe I'll do this, but like, what do you want from me? And why are you doing this? And so at the same time that Frady reached out to me initially to ask if I would do the research, my sister was dying and she was an Orthodox Jew. And so she converted, like we grew up Jewish, but not that kind of Jewish. And so she converted into Orthodoxy, not like black hat Orthodoxy, but modern Orthodoxy, but still seeing Jessica's life as she lived and then seeing their world hold them as she was dying and then after she died. Like I'll never forget the picture of, we were sitting Shiva, which is, when someone dies and you're observing the 7 days after they die in their backyard. And my nephew's whole class showed up. And they like walked down the driveway and they knew exactly what to do. They sat in the back row and we said the prayers together. And then they came up and they said to each of us, like, may you be comforted along with the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. And they were so comfortable, like acknowledging this tragic loss. He and the children were so held. And so I bring to the work like a real appreciation for the beauty of an observant religious life. And I do not think of it as a cult. I know that's a place where there's some daylight between me and Frady because she does. But I see the reasons that people find meaning in that. And I have a real respect for that. And I try to convey to people when I'm talking with them about the research that the goal of the book is to also show what is good about this way of life. And that's why we work so hard to recruit people who are observant and happy about it.
So where are you with that? You've collected your data. Where are you with that?
So we're at the tail end of doing the data collection. I mean, so let me tell you a quick story. Yossi described his marriage as a crime with no criminal. And he didn't mean that he hated his wife. In fact, he was grateful that they had sort of a shared vision about religious observance, and she seemed like a reasonably okay person. They had their ups and downs as human beings, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was that he had always desired men since he could remember. And he knew, like, he knows what it says in Leviticus about that. He didn't think that his desire, there's anything wrong with his desire, but he also knew that it wasn't a desire that he could ever act on in that world. Before he was 20, he was studying in Israel, and someone knocked on his door at 2 in the morning and they said, "There's a match for you." And he was on a plane back home by 7 a.m. And by 10 that night, they were celebrating his engagement.
Wow.
And he at no point had any choice in that. And he described his marriage as a forced marriage. And why can't he leave? He can't leave because he works in Yiddish. And so leaving the marriage would mean leaving the community, would mean leaving his livelihood. Why do we have schools that allow people to be raised without speaking English? Right? That's a failure to conform to New York state law. So there are yes, we can point fingers, and it is true that this is a world in which there's no space for people to be queer. I asked one man who had sexual desire for men, and I say that because he didn't identify as gay, but he did have sexual desire for men. I asked him if he ever thought about marrying a man, and he looked at me. He was sitting in his car when I interviewed him. He looked at me and he said, "It would be like saying you want to marry a cat." Like, there's just no possibility of that in this world. So, one thing that I will talk about in the book is that forced marriage, you might immediately think of a woman, turns out to be a problem for men as well.
And as much as you raise the question, what is sex? I'm wondering, what is marriage?
Right. What is marriage? And in this community, marriage is, among other things, a way to get back at Hitler. Right? So, I mean, people say, like, when I have a family of 8 children, I'm getting back at Hitler, right? So this is the historical trauma and the idea that, like, sex and reproduction, first of all, it's a commandment from God, but also it's, about your commitment to Jewish continuity. The whole, like, optic of choice and agency and self-determination, in the same way that with my dissertation research, I realized I was asking the wrong question, I think focusing on individual choice in this project is the wrong question. Because it's not just about what individuals choose, it's about the broader context and history within which they make those choices. You're supposed to have sex 7 days after you stop menstruating. So, like, you stop menstruating, you count 7 clean days, you go to the ritual bath, you have sex. That's mikveh night. So it's a question, like, is sex on mikveh night really a choice if it's also a commandment and you're told in your bride classes that you can't say no to your husband? And so I asked this woman I interviewed, is that a choice for you to have sex on mikveh night? And she said, no, I don't choose to have sex on mikveh night, but I choose to follow Jewish law. So, like, for her, she was buying the whole package. She was buying the whole pizza. She wasn't, like, picking onions off of it. So it was the whole thing. And who am I to disrespect that as a choice, right? So I think that we also, as anthropologists, as scientists, have to listen to people as they narrate their lives and to hold that with some respect. So I'm not going to say that she has false consciousness, that she is actually oppressed. She's choosing the life that she wants and finding it beautiful. Other people experience mikveh night sex as rape.
So who is this book that you're currently working on for?
So it's not, it might seem initially like kind of a niche project, like a project about Orthodox Jews in New York, but it speaks to fundamental questions that we struggle with in America about tensions between religious freedom and the protection of human rights, about men controlling women's bodies, about the circumstances under which people can build the kinds of families they want, about what is required to build a world in which sexual minorities are protected. So, like, these are very live questions that the case study happens to be among this population with which I have to say there is like an enormous public fascination. But the questions are questions that we're struggling with across America. So the book is for everyone who reads.
As a scholar of this domain, however, what are the characteristics that you would describe for healthy relationships?
So one thing, it's funny, like I both embrace and reject the idea of healthy relationships because I feel like it puts a sort of like health moralism because we don't really mean healthy as in like free of sexually transmitted infection transmission. We really mean good relationships. So I like to just call that out. Like, what is the kind of good relationship I think people should be having? And I'm deeply agnostic about sexual projects. Like, unless you're my kid, in which case I have a few opinions. But people should live their best lives, right? Like, people, whatever people want to do, as long as they're doing it with someone else who wants to do that, who am I to judge, right? Like, I wouldn't want to go to a party and hook up with strangers. But I think those are things that people do legitimately because it's what they want to do. My job as a public health person is to push for conditions in which people can do whatever they want to do without getting hurt or hurting other people. My job as a mom is to raise people who will be menschy young men. I don't really have an answer for like what is the right kind of sexual relationship. And in fact, I believe passionately that we don't want policymakers having that answer either, right? Like we want policymakers who are not going to impose sexual projects on a citizenry that has a very diverse set of ideas about how they want to live.
How do generational differences influence attitudes around sexuality, consent, and education?
I mean, the olds always have a moral panic about the youngs, right? Like early in the 20th century, it was bicycles, right? Like women were riding bicycles. It was going to lead us all down the road to perdition. Then it was cars. Women are getting in cars with men. We're all going to hell. And now it's the Tinder, right? Like the kids are on the Tinder. But I think all of those are like moral panics around technology where the olds forget that they were once young and doing something that made the other olds freak out. I don't even know where to start in terms of like the many ways in which our policymakers are failing us right now. You know, when we go to campuses, the students frequently have such passion for making change. And they're always like, what should I do on this campus? And we're always like, get off campus and go to the State House, right? Like, I think that the key to policy change is civic engagement. And so the people in their offices who are in their 70s or 80s and don't understand that, like, it's a perfectly normal thing to meet someone on Tinder or Grindr or whatever, like, they're not going to solve these problems unless they understand that they won't get reelected unless they solve the problem. So I think it really does all come down to organizing, getting young people involved in the democratic process. We're not going to get better policy until we have better policymakers.
Well, thank you so much for sitting down with us
and directing us on how we can all do better and be better sexual citizens. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. I mean, ultimately, even though the topic is a sad topic, the tone of the book is hope and optimism, because we really do think that like there are so many things that we could be doing better at to build a world in which all people can thrive. We got this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That concludes today's program.
BornCurious is brought to you by Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Our producer is Catello Grazioso. Kevin Grady, Anna Song,
Sky Jung, Emerson Prond, and Cabin 3 Media provided editing and production support.
Many thanks to Jane Huber for editorial support.
And we are your co-hosts. I'm Heather Min.
And I'm Ivelisse Estrada.
Our website where you can listen to all our episodes is radcliffe.harvard.edu/BornCurious. If you have feedback, you can email us at info@radcliffe.harvard.edu.
You can follow Harvard Radcliffe Institute on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Threads. And as always, you can find BornCurious wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for learning with us.
And join us next time.